Maxwell's wasn't the kind of place where bad news usually got delivered. White linen napkins, polished cutlery, waiters in crisp uniforms. It was where deals were made, not ended. So when Preston, our CEO, invited me to lunch there, I knew something was off, but I went anyway. We shook hands across the table. He smiled too much. Asked how I was holding up with the latest system migration like he genuinely cared. I gave him my usual answer. Smooth as ever. The waiter took our orders, and by the time Preston's filet arrived, the real reason for the lunch appeared. In the spaces between his words. "You've been invaluable to Riverton," he began, slicing into his steak. 11 years of consistent excellence. I don't think we'd be where we are without you." I nodded slowly. "Here it comes. But," he continued, "the board feels it's time for a new perspective. Someone who can bring a more modern vision to our tech operations." I sipped my water. "Someone like Harrison's nephew." He blinked, clearly caught, off guard that I already knew. "Nathan's just finished his master's at MIT, brilliant kid. We're lucky to have him." "Of course you are," I smiled. Not the kind of smile that invites warmth, more the kind you give when you've stopped being surprised by the world. "Who's handling the transition?" I asked. Preston relaxed, like that was the response he'd hoped for. "We were thinking, 6 weeks. You'll help onboard him, make sure it's smooth. Announcement goes out after the quarterly all hands." I nodded again. Business is business, right? He slid an NDA across the table before dessert. I signed it without reading too. Deeply, smiled again, shook his hand like we'd just wrapped a successful merger. But inside I was already sifting through log files in my head. I'd seen the cracks forming for months. They thought they were getting ahead of me. They didn't realize I'd already started keeping receipts. Back at my desk, the air felt thinner. The kind of stillness that follows something unspoken. People around me worked like nothing had changed, because for them, nothing had. But for me, every keystroke, every network ping, was underlined with a finality I wasn't ready to admit out loud. Out of habit, or maybe instinct, I opened the server logs. Not because I had to, no one asked me to, but I needed to see something. Anything that made this feel less like an execution and more like a pattern I could solve. There they were, a cluster of strange authentication attempts, time-stamped late at night, spaced out every few days. At first glance, nothing major, but the access requests weren't from external threats. They were internal, executed from an IP block assigned to the executive floor. I drilled deeper. They weren't trying to breach the systems. They were poking around silently, methodically, accessing encrypted files, reviewing contingency protocols. Things that had no business being reviewed unless you were preparing for a takeover or a teardown. My teardown. Each file name hit a nerve. Core sync interface.log. Failover map 2020. Backup script chain v3. I hadn't shared those files with anyone in years. They were tucked away, guarded behind multi-tiered access. Even our own IT staff didn't know some of them existed. And yet someone was combing through them like a blueprint for a home they were about to move into. I checked the log ID tied to the access. A new admin credential, created 3 weeks ago. Username nblake.admin.nathanblake. The nephew, so the replacement wasn't a future plan. It was already in motion, long before the lunch. Long before Preston's carefully rehearsed gratitude. This wasn't transition, this was extraction. They weren't just letting me go, they were taking me apart first, piece by piece. System by system, until all that remained was a signature on a napkin. I came to Riverton 11 years ago with 2 suitcases, a bruised ego, and a divorce decree still warm from the courthouse printer. Ellie had left the papers on the kitchen counter, like a reminder I didn't need. 7 years together. No yelling, no final blowout, just we want different things. And apparently, what she wanted didn't include me. I moved in with my brother, slept on his couch, and spent the nights staring at the ceiling wondering how I'd gone from a rising star in Minneapolis IT to a man with nothing but a recycled resume, and a silent phone. When Riverton called about a contract role to fix a failing server after a ransomware attack, I almost didn't go. But I did. The network was a disaster. Fragmented architecture, unsecured ports, sticky notes with passwords taped to monitors. They were trying to run 3 production facilities on systems held together with chewing gum and habit. But I saw something in the chaos. Possibility. A system broken badly enough that no one would stop me from rebuilding it the right way. I pitched Preston, back when he was still a VP, a 5-year overhaul, bold, expensive. He blinked once, then handed me the keys. "Do it," he said. "Just don't let the machine stop." For 3 years, I barely saw daylight. I slept under my desk more times than I can count, rewrote every firewall rule, mapped the infrastructure from scratch, brought in backups, redundancy, air gaps. I built things people didn't even know they needed, then trained them how to depend on it. We survived the Northeast blackout without losing a single production line. After that, they started inviting me to meetings. My budget tripled. I hired people like Vanessa, whose instincts were better than most managers, and Luis, who could code blindfolded. I didn't just build Riverton's IT backbone, I became it. Somewhere in the middle of rebuilding their systems, I started rebuilding myself. The late nights in the server room felt less like work and more like recovery. There was a comfort in the hum of machines that didn't lie, didn't leave, didn't change their minds. Riverton became more than a job. It became a place where I mattered again. At least I thought it had. It started small, like all erasures. To a missing email here, a skipped meeting invite there. My name was no longer included on the leadership briefing calendar. At first, I thought it was an oversight, maybe a scheduling error. But patterns have always been my specialty. And this one wasn't accidental. Every Friday, we held a department sync. I used to run them. Suddenly, they were canceled. Or so I thought, until Luis let it slip that they were still happening, just without me. Vanessa confirmed it a week later. "They're calling it a strategic realignment," she said quietly. "Nathan's been leading the meetings." She looked uncomfortable, like simply saying it made her complicit. The updates kept coming. New versions of documents I authored were now stored under Nathan's admin account. My private design notes, the ones I'd buried deep in subfolders, were appearing in company decks without attribution. Every system I'd touched was now his playground. I walked past the war room one afternoon and caught a glimpse of Nathan at the whiteboard, outlining infrastructure I built from the ground up. He was explaining it confidently, like it had always belonged to him. No footnotes, no acknowledgement, just ownership. Handed to him on a silver platter because of his last name. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I watched the process unfold like someone attending their own wake. Quiet nods, careful language. Nobody looked me in the eye. The worst part wasn't being excluded. It was being studied. Every question Nathan asked a team member was a test. Every compliment he gave was positioning. He wasn't just replacing me, he was deconstructing me, taking what I'd made and rebranding it with a newer logo and younger smile. It was surgical, methodical, and completely impersonal. No grand betrayal, just a quiet deletion bit by bit, until even the systems I built stopped recognizing my name. Luis and I met before work, just like old times, coffee cups warming our hands as we sat near the window at Joe's Cafe. The morning rush hadn't begun yet, so the only sounds were the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of early traffic outside. He looked tired, not physically, emotionally. I could tell he'd figured it out too. "They're phasing you out," he said without preamble. I nodded. Quietly, strategically. They've been at it for a while. He stared down at the ripples in his coffee. "They've been asking me about your systems, the ones I never touched." I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. "That's because they're not in the documentation." Luis looked up, brows raised. "I built them outside my contract. Late nights, on my own framework. I licensed some of them to Riverton, yes, but not all, and none of it's fully replicable without what's in here. I tapped the side of my head. You're saying they don't own. I'm saying they're standing on foundations they don't understand. I paused. And if they try to break ground, the whole structure will shift. Luis exhaled slowly, like the realization had just sunk in. System sync? I nodded once. That, and more. The client-side interface, the error prediction models, the adaptive load scripts. None of that exists in their training manuals. He hesitated, then said, They think they can just hand it all over to Nathan. They think the system works because it's modern, I replied. It works because I made it speak the language of their machines. No one else speaks that dialect. We sat in silence for a while. The city started to wake up outside. They're going to regret this, he said finally. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. But I was starting to realize they didn't just fire me. They fired the one person who knew how to keep the lights on when the power went out. Darren called late, just after 11. He's not the kind of guy who calls unless it matters. We'd worked together years ago. Network security for a logistics company with more loopholes than firewalls. Brilliant, discreet, and loyal. I trusted him with the truth, and apparently he'd found some of his own. I poked around, he said. You were right. Something's moving. I sat up in bed, adrenaline overriding sleep. How big? Big. Enough, he replied. Riverton's prepping for acquisition. TechCore Industries, Boston-based manufacturing conglomerate. I found a leaked internal brief from their side, dated 3 weeks ago. Late-stage negotiations. That explained the urgency. The quiet meetings, the neutered emails. They weren't just replacing me. They were streamlining the optics. Guess whose name is listed as head of IT modernization? He added. I didn't answer. I already knew. Nathan Blake, he confirmed. Your work, your systems, your playbook. Listed under infrastructure upgrades completed by incoming tech. Director. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice calm. Does the valuation mention system sync? It's all over it, Darren said. They're leaning on your tools hard, marketing them as custom digital control layers enabling scalable automation. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on nothing. And get this, he said. Harrison cashed out most of his shares last quarter. The buyout deal heavily benefits Preston and a few top execs. They get golden parachutes and landing spots at TechCore. Everyone else? Discretionary review. So this wasn't just replacement. It was asset stripping, using me to inflate their price tag and discarding me before the ink dried. Darren's voice softened. You were never supposed to make it to the end of the quarter, Derek. They started clearing space for Nathan months ago. I closed my eyes. The last 6 months made perfect sense now. The canceled meetings, the executive floor logins, the push to document and delegate everything. They needed my system to sell the company, but they didn't want me included in the deal. I thanked Darren and hung up, then sat there for a long time in the dark, surrounded by the quiet hum of a house that didn't yet know a storm was coming. They wanted a clean transition, a polished facade. They forgot that behind every system is a human fingerprint, and mine was all over everything they were selling. The old hard drive was buried deep in a box labeled Garage Misc, tucked behind camping gear I hadn't touched since before the divorce. It was heavier than I remembered, matte black, with a faint scratch across its side like a scar from another lifetime. When I plugged it in, it whirred to life slower than modern drives, but steady. Folder by folder, the past came back. Versioned backups, early interface prototypes, sleepless night experiments coded in between ramen dinners and 2 a.m. Spotify loops. And there it was. System Sync, version 0.9. A leaner build. Rougher edges, but unmistakably mine. Time-stamped and archived, 8 months before my Riverton start date. File after file, cleanly labeled, clearly structured. All of it developed on my personal time. My laptop, my framework. Then came the emails, the ones I'd forgotten I saved. A thread from Preston, back when I was still a contractor. Incredible work, Derek. We'll integrate system sync with our manufacturing network for now, but once we finalize your role, we'll revisit licensing. Another. Let's keep your IP structure flexible for now. We can formalize later. Later never came. I had trusted him, trusted the promise, and they'd use that trust to build their empire. I closed the laptop and picked up the phone. The lawyer I called was sharp, efficient, and asked all the right questions. Within a day, I was filing provisional patents. Not for the entire suite, but for the key components. The ones that made the system intelligent: predictive load balancing, real-time machine response adaptation, smart failover logic. Those were mine. Legally defensible, enforceable. I didn't broadcast it, didn't make noise. I wasn't here to burn anything, not yet. But they thought they'd taken everything, thought they'd extracted and repackaged my value. They didn't realize I'd built the blueprint in a different house, and now I had the deeds. I showed up early every day that week. Polished, professional, not a hint of friction. I answered Nathan's questions without hesitation, walked him through server architecture diagrams, even pretended to laugh at his awkward attempts at small talk. I watched him closely. The way he furrowed his brow when he didn't understand a core process. The way he glossed over my warnings about peak load balancing. He didn't know what he didn't know. I handed off neatly written documentation. Flowcharts. Admin walkthroughs. As far as they could see, I was doing my part. Helping the transition succeed. Playing the loyal lieutenant. But I wasn't there to help anymore. I was there to finish what I started. That Friday, I sat alone at my desk long after the others had gone. The lights overhead buzzed softly, the hum of the servers faint in the background. I opened the command line and logged in using a credential that Nathan hadn't found. One Luis had quietly re-enabled, buried deep within the logs. I reviewed the deployment one last time. 3 trigger points, 1 license verification, a single silent expiry, tied to the custom core modules they didn't even know they were relying on. Nothing destructive, no damage, no tampering, just expiration. A polite automatic check that would say, "Time's up." The system would continue running, of course, but only if the license were renewed properly by the original creator. I keyed in the timestamp. 8 days from today. The day after I walked out for good. I encrypted the update, pushed it through, then locked it down with signature verification tied to my secure backup. It was beautiful in its simplicity, invisible, elegant. And when I was done, I sat back in my chair and exhaled. Not with anger or triumph, just calm. They thought they'd taken everything, but all they'd ever had were borrowed keys, and I had just changed the locks. Monday morning dawned quiet and clear. I didn't set an alarm. There was no office to report to, no meetings to attend, no goodbyes to repeat. Just sunlight spilling through the blinds and a coffee mug warm in my hands. At 9:17 a.m., the exact moment the production floor usually shifted, into peak load, I got the first call. Unknown number. I let it ring. By 9:20, the second came in. Another unfamiliar ID. Then a third. I ignored them all, sipped my coffee, and watched the steam rise. Across 3 Riverton facilities, every system sync module triggered the same quiet protocol. Not a crash, not a wipeout, but a graceful, controlled stop. Just one message on every screen. License expired. Please contact the developer to renew. The custom integration layer, the one no one else had truly understood, had done exactly what I designed it to do. It didn't shut the systems down maliciously. It simply asked for something that no one else could give. Me. By 9:45, the full extent of the lockout had hit. Machine interfaces frozen. Production lines halted mid-run. Operators staring at the screens, waiting for IT to fix what they didn't know was broken. The 4th call came from Preston's personal number. I answered that one. "What the hell did you do?" he snapped, trying to sound composed but unraveling. With every syllable, I kept my tone level. "The system is functioning as it should. The software license expired. You sabotaged it. It's standard license behavior. Clause 7 of the original integration agreement, I said. Riverton was licensing the proprietary technology, not owning it. Silence. I've already sent a renewal proposal to your legal team, I added. Ownership acknowledgement, compensation, NDA, all very professional. You'll never work in this industry again, he growled. Maybe, but the lights don't come back on without me. I ended the call. Let the silence settle again. In the space of 20 minutes, they'd gone from power to panic. And all I'd done was let the clock run out. Not vengeance, just a reminder. You don't get to rewrite the code and erase the author. Preston's second call came around 10:30. Voice sharper this time, desperation thinly veiled behind corporate bluster. This is extortion, he hissed. You're holding our entire production hostage. I leaned against my kitchen counter, phone tucked between my shoulder and cheek, the smell of fresh coffee lingering. I didn't raise my voice. No, Preston, I said. This is enforcement. The terms were always clear. Clause 7. Licensing. Agreement, not a transfer of ownership. You signed it. I still have the email chain. You expect us to just pay you off? I expect you to act like professionals, I replied. This system sync, wasn't just some internal tool. It was mine. You used it, benefited from it, sold it as your asset to a potential buyer, without my consent. That's not a gray area. That's theft. Silence. TechCore won't go through with the acquisition if they find out. I haven't told them anything, I said, cutting him off. But if I'm forced to, I will. I have every version of the original source code. Every timestamp, every message where you acknowledged it was mine. I've also filed provisional patents on the core features. So no, this isn't extortion. I let the words settle before continuing. It's a choice. More silence. You get to decide whether this becomes a story about a licensing oversight or a tech theft lawsuit that tanks a multi-million-dollar deal and sends red flags to every investor you've courted in the last year. He exhaled, slow and uneven. What are your terms? I kept it simple. Recognition of ownership, fair licensing compensation for continued use, a non-disclosure clause covering the terms of my departure, and I want it signed today. You're asking us to reward you for pulling this stunt? No, Preston, I said coolly. I'm asking you to pay for what you took. The stunt was trying to sell something that didn't belong to you. The call ended without a goodbye. I watched the steam curl from my mug, a quiet satisfaction rising in my chest. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. The email from TechCore hit my inbox that evening, simple and formal. We'd like to meet to discuss a potential strategic relationship. When I walked into their regional office the next day, I expected a stiff conversation, legalese and cautious pleasantries. Instead, the VP of Operations offered me coffee and handed over a proposal. Consulting lead for the Riverton integration. Remote optional, full autonomy. Double what I'd been earning. We're still acquiring them, he said. But after what's happened, we'd rather work with the mind that built the system than the people who tried to claim it. He didn't mention Nathan by name, but I didn't have to ask. I'd heard from Luis earlier that morning, and the nephew was no longer leading IT. No farewell email, no announcement, just gone. The official story was that he was pursuing outside opportunities. The real story? His changes had destabilized the system even before the license expired. Key clients had complained. Some contracts were at risk. As for Preston, word was his role would become advisory once the acquisition closed. He'd get his payout, sure, but no title worth a damn. No department, no team. No real decisions left in his hands. By the end of that week, Vanessa called to say she'd resigned. The next day, Luis did too. Then Margot from Systems Architecture. Quiet departures, no drama. Just quiet exits to something new. I didn't have a company name yet, but the team was coming together on its own. People weren't following me because I made noise. They were following because they remembered who had built the foundation. I signed the consulting contract with TechCore that afternoon. When I walked out of that office, briefcase in one hand and sun on my shoulders, it wasn't pride I felt. It was clarity. I hadn't just gotten even. I'd gotten free. The cabin wasn't big, it didn't have to be. Just a modest A-frame tucked near the edge of a quiet lake, a wraparound deck that caught the morning light, and a wide stretch of sky that reminded me to breathe. I signed the papers with my first check from TechCore, then stood on that deck alone, watching the still water reflect a sky untouched by deadlines or boardrooms. It wasn't luxury. It was freedom. Each morning I brewed coffee with the back door open and listened to birds cut across the silence. Some nights I sat on the dock with my laptop, not working, just building again, for myself this time. System Sync had been mine, long before Riverton tried to steal it. Now it was truly mine again. Cleaner, sharper, smarter. Vanessa ran point on client communications. Luis led our integration team. We weren't a company in name yet, but the work flowed steadily. And no one could take credit for what we created. About a year after the acquisition, I ran into Preston. It was at a restaurant downtown. I was grabbing takeout on my way to meet Vanessa for a meeting. He was sitting alone at the bar, suit slightly wrinkled, eyes a bit duller than I remembered. He saw me and hesitated, then stood, walked over. "You won," he said quietly, not bitter, just tired. I studied him for a long moment. I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel triumph. "It was never about winning," I replied. "It was about value, knowing what something's worth, including myself." He nodded once and turned away, stepped out into the cold evening air, bag in hand, and crossed the street as the city lights flickered on behind me. Some systems collapse. Some are rebuilt. And some are reclaimed by the one who built them in the first place.